I go back and forth when I talk about Rutgers football, right? Because, I say this as somebody who grew up in the Northeast and constantly try to support schools like Rutgers and Boston College and Syracuse as much as possible. But damn, does it get frustrating sometimes because you sit there and say to yourself, Greg Schiano says all the right things in press conferences. He's a guy that, at least for me, his message as a school that whose identity is about maintaining discipline and development and all those things. But you kind of ask yourself, has Rutgers hit their ceiling with Greg Schiano? And I think it's quite frankly a question that's worth asking after, some of the defensive shambles that we saw. And what is going to be a legitimate question mark for me is it's a number of different things, right? Which I'm going to dive into right now. But first off, most importantly, it's going to be this defense, right? The worst defensive line that I've seen in a number of years at Rutgers, one of the worst units really in all of college football, really. That surrendered about just shy of eight yards of play. But hey, they let Rob Smith and Zach uh, Starber go. They're still kind of looking right now in terms of who their next defensive coordinator can be. For those of you, there's shout out to Andrew Rice and Richie O'Leary. Both those guys are great at covering Rutgers as well, so definitely give them a listen too. But when you kind of look at this team overall, there's a couple things that kind of stick out at you, right? And I'll dive a little bit more into the defense, but one thing that I know for sure about Rutgers football, and there are only a handful of things, right? But the one thing that I am absolutely confident about is they can freaking develop guys when they want to. And I think wide receivers coach Dave Brock has done a phenomenal job at that over the past couple years in particular. But when you look at guys like KJ, like Duff, like Strong, and you sit there and say to yourself, man, they just make highlight play after highlight play, particularly that one-handed catch that Duff made versus Penn State at the end of the year. That was just absolutely sensational. And also turns to the running backs too. Antoine Raymond deserves a big shout out too. But I kind of asked myself, can Rutgers hold on to those guys? Because that's really kind of the big jumping off point, right? Because the idea, if you're a team like Rutgers, you got to bring in guys who can come in as freshmen, continue to develop, continue to play early, and then by the time they could become juniors and seniors, continue to improve and ultimately end up becoming meaningful and impactful contributors. And the issue is that you can only do that so much in this day and age of the transfer portal. And I think Greg Schiano and this Rutgers staff has done a solid enough job at kind of finding some gems in the transfer portal. I think, for example, getting Kaliakmanis from Minnesota to be their quarterback the last couple of years, I think he did a solid enough job. I think people underrate his athleticism. I don't think he makes too many crazy mistakes in terms of his quarterback play, and so you had enough there to at least say to yourself, why can't Rutgers consistently go to a bowl game every year? And I know that's not something that fans want to hear necessarily. I mean, nobody wants to sit there and say be a perennial 6-win team. But for the time being, I don't necessarily think that's the end of the world, because I don't think anybody is sitting there championing Rutgers to be the Big Ten champion next year. Although I would love that, nobody is actually out there sitting there saying, oh, Rutgers should be in the Big Ten championship every year. But in terms of kind of what this Rutgers team needs to do this offseason, there's going to be a couple of question marks here, because not only did Rutgers defense struggle last year, but the guys that did somewhat make an impact last year are all leaving now. So it's not only you're taking over a team that struggled last year, but you're also taking over a guy that doesn't really have a great foundation in terms of juniors and seniors that you can kind of pick up the pieces and just develop them a little bit more and kind of go from there. Because some young guys like Sam Robertson, like Abram Wright, like Moses Walker, who really don't have enough, who have some college experience playing, but they don't have enough experience to necessarily say, okay, we can just slot them in there, and then we can just get some transfer guys in the back and ultimately kind of figure that out. Because the problem is that did we did we find bits and pieces where that Rutgers defense played solid? Absolutely, but it wasn't consistent enough. No, it wasn't consistent enough, and the same problems not only plagued them in the conference play, but also in non-conference play as well. I remember in the beginning of the year watching Rutgers versus Ohio and kind of thinking to myself, man, this is Rutgers defense right now, letting Parker Navarro run all over them. I mean, that dude ran for I think over 150 yards in that game, and they put up some points on us too. So that was kind of my first red flag in terms of, oh shit, like if they kind of keep this up, this is really not going to be an ideal situation, because you're essentially going to be asking whoever comes in as your next defense coordinator to completely overhaul your defense overnight. And I just not really entirely sure who's going to want to take up that job, given that Rutgers has pretty limited NIL resources, given that you're competing in a ever so heavy Big Ten. But when you also see schools like Northwestern picking up guys like Chip Kelly, there's no reason why Rutgers can't take a swing on a guy like a Justin Wilcox or a Mark Stoops, because why not? Why not try to get Justin Wilcox there? If you can get a guy like him who's been a defense coordinator at schools like Oregon and Tennessee and has had almost 10 years of head coaching experience to get on that staff, why not? And I don't like the idea of Greg Schiano calling plays before anyone else says that too. I've never really been a huge fan of the head coach who's also calling plays, who's also kind of trying to recruit, who's also kind of heading the transfer portal. And I've never been a huge fan of that, because when you look at head coaches who have won national championships, one of the common denominators between all of them is they didn't coach on offense or defense. They didn't call plays. They were the CEO, they ran the team, and they figured it out. But here's kind of where I'm getting at too, in terms of Rutgers too, is you're not only overhauling the defense, but I think the offense is gonna take some work too, because they were absolutely plagued with injuries this year, and it's one of those things where it is going to take a little bit of time to kind of figure that out. I think they have made some changes in terms of the training staff and whatnot too, and we're obviously hopeful and optimistic that that's going to kind of come together, but there has to be a real conversation about where this Rutgers program is heading, because I'm very concerned right now that there hasn't really been an announcement in terms of the new defensive coordinator. And the other thing is too is you know there's only so much that Rutgers can do in terms of recruiting, right? Because this season they ranked 41st in the country in recruiting, which I actually don't even think you can sit there and complain about that too bad, because it's really not bad. The problem is your core footprint, right? Is what? It's New York, it's New Jersey, it's Eastern Pennsylvania, and perhaps a little bit of Southern Connecticut if you want to throw that in there too. But what we're kind of seeing in terms of the trends in terms of Rutgers recruiting classes is they're finding different ways to go outside their core footprint, which I do think overall is a positive, right? Because you were able to get guys in this class like Dysere Carter and Elias Koch, who I think what's his face Carter is from Virginia. So you do kind of see some hints of them kind of leaning towards other states in terms of the transfer portal and everything. But this is all me, just a long-winded way of me saying that I really want this to work with Greg Schiano. I think he has done a pretty solid job at making the most of what he's kind of been inherited for the most part. I think he's proven that you can win at Rutgers. He's proven that with that you can play with an identity, that you can legitimately develop talent there. It just seems like for all the talent that they get, they all end up leaving as soon as they're supposed to hit that third or fourth season where they're supposed to hit the ground running and then become an 8 or 9 win team. But this is definitely going to be a pretty overwhelming turnaround for them. I'm definitely a little bit concerned about how that kind of all comes together because, obviously 22 commits is great. 9% in state is not ideal, but you have guys like Dazier Carter, you have Ronaldo Callaway, you have guys like Jared Smith who are kind of all coming in there, and it's going to be one of those things where I'm absolutely hopeful as a Rutgers fan that they're going to figure it out, but there's definitely some serious question marks that they're going to have to address this offseason too.